Welcome back. Today we're talking about Chapter 2, the field of communication from historical and contemporary perspectives. So this is all coming out of the Wood textbook, and page numbers here are largely for the newest edition, but the same information should appear in older ones. So every now and then I'll give you a brain refresh, and the idea is to check your knowledge. If it's not in your head, it should definitely be in your notes. So review the questions. This is by no means everything you should know from the previous chapter, but just a reminder of some of the crucial concepts. So you should know, what definition of communication are we working with from Wood? You should be able to say, what are the three communication models and which one does the definition best fit with? So this means you're going to need to understand and break down the definition and the pieces of it and big picture how it looks at the world in order to get a sense of which of those three communication models we talked about in the last lecture best fit with that definition. And then last but not least is, what does it mean that communication is constitutive? So this was definitely talked about in the lecture, and it's a big concept for human communication studies in general. So within Chapter 2, the focus questions that Wood gives us, remember these are always listed on the first page of the chapter, and they should help give you a sense of how to focus or things to make sure you know when you're done with the chapter. So in what context did the study and teaching of communication begin? What methods do communication scholars use to conduct research? What areas of study and teaching constitute the discipline of communication today? What themes unify areas of study within the field of communication? As we talk about communication, it's important to note this is a very old discipline that has definitely ebbed and flowed. It's not been consistently popular or headlining. Started way back 2,500 years ago, way back in the BCs with Aristotle, Plato, Socrates. So Aristotle actually gave us a book called On Rhetoric, and so communication started with the study of rhetoric, which is the development of messages, how to craft a message for an audience in order to persuade them and influence them. And there was a lot of debates going on back in the time about what were the right and wrong ways to do that. Those are large enough debates. I'll reserve them for a rhetorical criticism class or the history of rhetoric class. But it is important to know that rhetoric is where the entire discipline comes from, even though now we have so many branches of it. So then we hit the Dark Era, Dark Ages, and really the only person that we see talking about communication is St. Augustine. And he's talking about how to persuade audiences to come to God, how to convince them that this is the true way of life. We start to move into the Enlightenment many, many years later, and we get Bacon and Locke and other Enlightenment-based scholars and theorists and philosophers talking about communication, talking about interacting with others, talking about philosophies of rhetoric and persuasion, and about what we call belles letters, which is the beautiful art. So we then move forward, and in about the 1920s, we start to see communication as we know it develop as a field in the US. And around the 1950s, 60s, a man named Kenneth Burt came along. And if you ever study rhetoric, he's someone whose name you will be hearing a lot. He gave us some pretty large concepts that have influenced the field a lot. Then, more recently, a gentleman who only died a few years ago is Dr. Stuart Hall. And he was focused on cultural aspects of communication, how our cultural identity, how race, how colonialism affect interactions, affect society, affect people's place in the world and their access to resources. And then last on the images here, we have Dr. Julia Wood. She still currently works at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which is one of the premier programs within communication studies for several of the different areas. I believe she's retiring soon, but she is the author of your textbook and many, many others, and has been in the field for decades. I do want to note that we'll be looking at the dominant Western tradition of communication. And so as I trace Aristotle, Plato, St. Augustine, the Enlightenment, Burke, right, these are all very dominant Western tradition perspectives. So when I talk about Western, I'm talking about the Enlightenment-based Western Europe, and then other nations that stemmed from Western Europe, such as Australia and the US, also count within that. Canada also counts. South America, however, and most of the global South does not. So Instead, we imported the more Western and Enlightened-based perspectives with colonialism to areas that otherwise had very different perspectives on the world. So it's important to remember that there are numerous non-Western communication traditions that stem from these different perspectives, such as Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, Hinduism, among many others. So just because we talk about these are the theories, these are not the only sets of theories. These are ones that fall within our more dominant perspectives. So in the contemporary period, in 1914, we saw the development of the National Association of the Academic Teachers of Public Speaking, and over the years this has developed into what we now call the National Communication Association. And they've gradually changed their name in order to reflect the broadening field of communication and the groups that are within the discipline. So between 1980 and 2010, according to NCA, because they track these types of stats, we actually had a huge increase in the bachelor's degrees that were awarded in communication and journalism. So you're definitely not alone. And the reason that communication and journalism are paired here is because in a lot of schools, majors, they're actually paired. There are some schools where we see communication and media studies. There are some where it's only speech, some pair theater, some pair journalism, and some have entirely different schools for those things. So communication is very diverse, and because it's developed over such an amount of time, it's also kind of developed in conjunction with other related disciplines. So you'll see it listed very differently depending on the school that you look at. So I'm not going to read all these to you, but if you go to the NCA, the National Communication Association's website, and I've actually given you the link in the bottom right corner, you can see some of the major areas within communication. This is not all of them. These are just some of the primary ones where research stems from. Quite a few of these we'll be talking about. We have chapters devoted to them. So for instance, small group communication, speech communication, organizational communication, interpersonal communication, international and intercultural, right? These are all areas that we'll be talking about. If you're interested in pursuing communication, health communication is a rapidly growing area, and it's also one that is far more easily translated outside of the universities into our massively expanding health field than some of the other areas. So each of the areas of communication includes many scholars, some of which identify with several, right? So they cross the boundaries between areas. And then every research area produces theories. Many of these use theories from other areas, and they adapt them to their own needs. But then they look at different contexts with them, and so they often have to then develop their own and get more specific with, okay, we've started with this theory from organization, but we're looking at groups, so how might that theory be different if we're only looking at groups? Some research areas are more often aligned with a very particular research methodology and method. So we're going to review some of the research methods, but it's worth knowing that, for instance, in interpersonal communication, traditionally, they more often use quantitative methods, right? That's increasingly changing. We have more scholars either mixing methods or just shifting away from some of the traditions to see other ways to look at these same contexts. And so just be aware that depending what areas you're interested in, you're likely to see some different types of methods than you might otherwise. So let's talk about what a theory is. Theories and perspectives. Every theory is a perspective. It's a different lens. And so if you take a look at the images that I've given you here, one is a magnifying glass and one is a flashlight. And the reason for that is that magnifying glasses and flashlights are often used as metaphors for what is a theory because they're perspectives. They're ways of looking at a topic. So a magnifying glass, if you use it, it focuses and increases the size of just a very small area. If you use a flashlight in a dark room, you see a very small spot, you see it focused in, you see it very brightly, and you don't really see the other things around it. And that's an important element of this because theories mean we focus in. We can't look at everything, and so a theory says, I'm going to look at this piece, and I'm going to try and understand this piece, right? And the reason I want to understand it is I'm trying to make sense of the world. I'm trying to make sense of how people interact, what happens when they do this in their interaction versus this, right? How can we build supportive climates? What makes for more unsupportive climates? So we look at just a small area and we leave kind of the rest of it to other theories, other perspectives. And it's important to note that when we look at a theory, it's an average, right? We're trying to make generalizations. We're trying to say, okay, across the board, in this type of scenario, here's what we think is going to happen. Here's why we think this is going to happen. But there's always going to be outliers, right? So it's a generalization about, in general, this is what we're going to see. This is what it means, right? But we cannot account for absolutely every case. And then assumptions about the way the world is, depending on what area you come from, depending on what other theories you're basing in, you approach the problem with different assumptions. You approach it thinking, okay, humans do X or humans do Y, right? And that's going to then shape the rest of the theory. So these assumptions often come from the historical context of the theory. Right? It says, all right, well, this theory developed straight out of Aristotle. But now we have a lot of theories that have developed in reaction to and contradictory to the ones that Aristotle came up with, right? To say, okay, he was right in that era, or that worked then, or that even worked, 80 years ago, but now we need to take a slightly different view. So it's important to have a sense of, when you break down a theory, kind of what is that theory responding to and what values are associated with it. So theories are linked to methods. In order to test theories, or even to create them in the first place, we have to conduct research. And to conduct research, we need to have methods to do so. There are tons of ways that we can go about conducting research, and that whole list of areas I showed you, there are numerous different types of methods within each of those areas, and definitely across those areas. And so the method that you select affects the information that you focus on, affects the information you find, and affects the theory that you create. So, because of this, some methods are better suited to studying some contexts or some relationships or answering some research questions than others are. And it's, sometimes the case that just says, okay, this is tradition, this is why we use quantitative here, this is why we use qualitative here. Right? So let's give you some more information about what this quantitative and qualitative is that I'm talking about. I've broken it all down for you so you can spend some time on the slide, pause it, read it, and I've tried to summarize what's going on in the book, and as you read down, I want you to notice that there's also an additional method not listed in the book, so just be aware that if you can't find it in there, it's because it's not there. So methods are how we conduct research, and I'm going to give you a way to kind of distinguish between this. I'm going to talk about traditions, method traditions, and that's going to be the big umbrella terms, but then within each tradition there are also these smaller specific methods. So a quantitative tradition, think quantity, is concerned with measurement and numerical. So specific methods within quantitative are going to be things like collecting statistics, big data surveys, conducting experiments, and these are useful for large populations, especially when you don't have the time to in-depth interview everybody, right? So if you want to survey everybody on campus, you're probably going to use quantitative methods. For example, you've probably seen this and used this. We have something called a Likert scale. So anytime you have answered a scale that says on this 1 to 7, really like, don't like, what do you answer? And then you take those numbers, run them through the stats programs, and come out with, okay, in general, here's what people thought about this situation. Qualitative, the umbrella tradition, think quality over quantity, and the focus here is interpretation. So if we're doing qualitative work, we're concerned with non-numerical aspects of communication, such as how someone experiences something. And so we're going to use specific methods, such as textual analysis, historical analysis, in-depth surveys and interviews, and ethnography. So these are very different types of surveys than we would get for quantitative. Quantitative, it's going to be, okay, answer on this scale, 1 to 10, or have you experienced this, yes or no? Whereas a qualitative survey and interview is going to be, tell me about the experience, right? Give me keywords, tell me what your emotions were, really give me an in-depth interpretation of how you experienced this. And so sometimes people will pair methods, so maybe we'll do this really big survey with a quantitative method, and then from that we'll say, okay, from our quantitative numbers, we're seeing that X, Y, Z are the most important things coming out for people. Now let's go interview 25 people about X, Y, Z so we can really try and understand the experience. And when we combine different methods, when we combine quantitative and qualitative, we call that triangulation. Even if there's only two of them, I know that triangle often refers to three. Even if there's only two of them, we refer to triangulation. One of the other methods for qualitative that you should know about is called ethnography, and this is the idea of going into a community, becoming part of that community, and really learning it from the inside out. This is very difficult to do, and it's really hard to reach the point where that community does not see you as outsiders. But if you can reach that point, we find that you get more honest answers because often in interviews, people give you answers they think you want to hear, right? Yes, they're going to, in general, answer truthfully, but they're also going to kind of pick and choose. Okay, they're asking about this, so I'm going to focus on my answer here and I'm going to leave these other things out, as opposed to living within a community and you start to get to hear that entire story. So I'm going to jump down to rhetorical criticism, and rhetorical criticism is focused on what counts as a text. I myself am generally a rhetorical critic, and so what we do is what counts as a text is maybe it's a protest, maybe it's a place, maybe it's an actual speech, and we're interested in public messages that are aimed at influencing others. And so we look at what strategies are used by the author to achieve this influence, to achieve an effective persuasion. And sometimes they don't work at all, so what's going on there? So with rhetorical criticism, we are doing textual analysis on a very broad range of what we call texts, and there's a lot of theories and methods even within rhetorical criticism. I mentioned Burke earlier in the history, so there are actually Burkean methods of criticism, there are Aristotelian methods, and there are critical methods, which we'll talk about now. So critical research methods is listed as an umbrella term, and this is an interesting one because this can be an umbrella term all by itself, or it can be paired with any of the others. Because a critical research method just says trying to count people by numbers is not enough. We are advocating for social justice. We want to give everybody a voice. Those people who are normally left out of research, we are trying to talk especially to them. So who is subject to the power structures of society and in what way, right? So the hardest fit for this is to pair quantitative and critical. Some scholars are starting to do that, but in general, critical and qualitative and critical and rhetorical criticism go very well together. And critical and performance studies always go together. So performance studies on the very bottom is this method that's not covered in your book. But I include it because the DU system, specifically our DU faculty, have a really strong focus in performance studies. And so if you're taking classes later, it's likely that you have already seen or are going to see a performance studies focus. And what that means is that we're interested in the study of cultural performance, such as personal narrative, literature, culture, technology, cultural rituals, public identities, political positions, and we're concerned with how do we perform our identities and how does that matter, right? How does that affect our interactions? So performance studies is always a critical perspective. So it's always concerned with power structures. It's always concerned with trying to advocate for social justice. Interestingly enough, performance studies, they really try and break out of the normal research box, and a lot of the scholars who they don't just study performance studies, they also practice it. They are practitioners and artists in their own right of performances, and that's often the form that some of their research takes, and not just research papers. So we've got a lot going on here, so be aware that we have these overarching traditions, quantitative, qualitative, critical research methods, rhetorical criticism, performance studies, and know some of the specifics kind of within each one. Let's take a minute to come back to quantitative, and the reason I do is because this is the basic scientific theory. This is where our fields move to, right? Other than the rhetorical focus, this is one of the first places people start looking of what makes for research, and it's that we're going to conduct this, right? Often an experiment. We actually have a lot of experiments in comm. So the way that we do this is first you have to develop a research question, and if you look in the additional resources, I've given you some resources about what is a research question, what makes for a strong one, how do we develop it. I strongly recommend looking at it because that's a task you're going to need to accomplish both for an assignment in this module, but also in many of your classes. So once we know what we want to look at, we try and form the hypotheses. We then have to try and test the hypotheses. So remember that hypotheses are educated guesses, and we often refer to it as just a capital H, right? So a capital H is your hypothesis. Hypotheses is plural. And so you test the hypothesis, and this is where all those methods come in. Well, how are you going to test it? What research model have you designed? And from your answers, from the data that you receive, you try and formulate your theory. And then you have to go back and test it again, right? Does my theory work? Does it not? So remember that a scientific theory is like a question. It's been put through a lot of tests. You go through this cycle again and again and again. And I want you to look over to the white diagram on the right and notice under hypotheses there's a term operationalization. And this is a term I definitely want you to take away from this. Operationalization is I'm going to explain the terms I'm using. I'm going to define what is communication. I'm going to define what is family. I'm going to define what is interaction, right, as a researcher, because then when other people come and follow up on this research, they can say, okay, we know how they were approaching this. We don't need to try and make assumptions and interpret what they were doing because they've told us what they were doing. And that really helps research be reliable and credible. So operationalization of terms is a very important part, and it basically says, here are the settings I'm working with in order to operate this research. I also want to take a moment again for that communication and empowerment and that critical perspective piece. And so Wood tells us that the critical perspective, we study the ways in which some people's communication is allowed and other people's communication is disallowed or disrespected. Equally, communication scholars seek to empower people whose voices historically have been muted so that they can participate fully in public and private interactions that shape the character of personal and collective life. So think about, what does it mean that some people's voices have historically been muted? What does it mean that some people's communication is disallowed or disrespected? And if you can't come up with specific examples of that. And it's also worth thinking about, okay, then how do we try and change that? Because that's really the goal of the critical perspective, is we want to understand communication, but we also want to advocate and make it socially just for everybody, because as it is, not everyone has access to the same venues of communication. Right, so think the political arena. We see a lot of candidates who look pretty similar, and how do we open that up to more different people with different types of identities? So I mentioned research questions. I'll go over just a quick comment here, but do go to the additional resources to spend some more time with it. I've also given you some additional resources about what makes for communication research, right? What are some interesting topics within communication research? And that's definitely information that I think it's worth looking at now in order to get a sense of, okay, if I pursue communication, what are some of the questions I might ask? So behind every research study is a research question, and this is really, what are you trying to find out? It's meant to guide and to focus your research and to draw boundaries around what you're going to look at and how you're going to look at it. When we think about communication research in particular, think about, we are focused on communicative aspects of interactions. So we're specifically focused on messages and their effect when we're doing communication research. So in comparison, some of the other majors or areas that people either confuse us with or say we're all the same are things like psychology, sociology, cultural anthropology, and history. And so just a quick comparison, for us, our foundational concept is message and the communicative aspects of interactions, whereas for psychology, that foundational concept is cognition. Everything comes back to cognition, what's going on in the brain. For communication, right, we do use some of that cognition piece, but largely to understand how is our perception of the world affecting our interaction, affecting those messages. Sociology, their foundational concept is groups, community, society. Cultural anthropology, that the underlying concept is called culture. How do people pass on their perspective of the world and their practices in the world from one generation to another? Why have they formed the practices that they have? And then history looks at events of the past. So in comparison, if you're a communication scholar, we argue that none of these things are possible without communication. Right? You don't get your cognition out, your cognition is affected by communication. We form groups and communities through communicating. We form culture through our interactions, through communicating. And events of the past wouldn't have happened without interactions. So communication scholars say that you can't do any of these other things without what we do, which is one of the reasons many years ago I picked up communication and rather than some of these other majors. So as we move through the rest of the book, each of the upcoming chapters will address an area of study with communication. Although this is a foundations class and the idea is to give you kind of a survey across the discipline, It's going to be brief. We can only cover so much, and as you've seen, the discipline is huge. So, in no particular order, we're going to look at some of the processes and skills that we use within communication and everyday interaction. And these are things like perceiving and understanding, verbal and nonverbal communication, listening and responding, culture, communication climates, all of these pieces. And we're also going to look at specific contexts that function that we use these processes and skills within. So contexts of personal identity, relationships, groups, organizations, public sphere, mass communication, and digital media. So as you can see, we have a lot ahead of us. The first and second chapter have served as a what is communication, what have I gotten myself into, and then all of the future and upcoming chapters and discussions will be more about, okay, now let's understand some of the actual bones and how can I apply these skills, and how do they apply differently within one context versus another. So remember, with all of these lectures, it is not meant to replace the reading or taking notes. You should have already read the chapter, and you should have taken notes on that chapter. This is a supplement to help clarify key concepts and expand upon some of them. I strongly recommend that you read the extra materials available in the chapter, such as the FYI boxes. These offer examples of these concepts in practice, and throughout the book, they're good ways to try and tie concepts to real events, which is one of the large goals of class.